Hashtag the top stories from Hacker News, week of August 24th through 30, 2025. Introduction. Welcome to our weekly roundup of the most important and engaging stories from Hacker News. This week, we reviewed over 200 posts to bring you the top 10 stories that really got the community fired up. From August 24th through the 30th, we saw some absolutely massive discussions. We're talking thousands of comments on topics ranging from the future of Android's openness to breakthrough AI developments and some pretty concerning trends in internet freedom. What's fascinating about this week is how many of these stories connect to each other. We're seeing this broader narrative about control, freedom, and who really owns the technology we use every day. So let's dive right in with a story that perfectly encapsulates these tensions. All right, so our first story is absolutely blowing up on Hacker News right now. Google announcing they'll only allow apps from verified developers to be installed on Android. And wow, with over 3,000 points and more than 2,300 comments, people are not happy about this one. You know, this feels like one of those moments where the tech world just shifts. Android has always been the open alternative to iOS, right? That's been its whole thing since day one. Want to install an APK from some random website? Go for it. Want to use F-Droid instead of the Play Store? No problem. Want to sideload that YouTube app that blocks ads? Android's got your back. Or at least it used to. What Google is apparently doing here is requiring developer verification for any app installation, even sideloaded ones. And the community reaction is, well, it's exactly what you'd expect. People are calling this a betrayal of everything Android stood for. One commenter put it perfectly. They said Android can no longer be considered truly open source if Google controls what you can install on your own device. And they're right. I mean, what's the point of having root access to your phone if you need Google's blessing to run the software you want? The discussion thread is fascinating because you can see this real sense of mourning. Like people are watching the last bastion of mobile computing freedom just disappear. Someone pointed out that we're basically heading toward a world where you don't actually own your devices anymore. You're just renting them from Google or Apple, and they get to decide what you can do with them. And here's what really gets me, the timing of this. YouTube Vanced gets shut down, ad blockers are under attack in Chrome, and now this? The pattern is pretty clear. One commenter nailed it when they said this isn't about security or protecting users. It's about protecting revenue streams. They don't want you blocking ads. They don't want you using alternative YouTube clients. They don't want you doing anything that might threaten their business model. What's really interesting is how this compares to Apple's approach. See, Apple's always had their walled garden, but at least they give you something in return. Generally better privacy, longer device support, a more polished experience. But Google, they want the control of iOS without providing any of those benefits. It's like the worst of both worlds. Now, there might be a silver lining here. Maybe. Some technical users in the thread are saying you might still be able to bypass this through Play Protect settings. So it could be more of a default restriction that power users can still work around rather than an absolute lockdown. But even if that's true, how long until that loophole gets closed? And more importantly, defaults matter. Most users never change them. One comment that really stuck with me was from someone who said they've been avoiding mobile development entirely, just waiting for the shenanigans to die down. But it seems like the shenanigans are only getting worse. We're moving toward this future where general-purpose computing on mobile devices is basically dead. Your phone becomes an appliance that only runs approved software, not a computer you actually control. The broader implications here are honestly pretty depressing. This isn't just about Android. It's about the entire direction of personal computing. We're seeing the same thing happen with Windows and their push toward the Microsoft Store, with smart TVs that won't let you install what you want, with game consoles that have always been locked down. The idea that you buy a device and can do whatever you want with it is becoming this quaint relic of the past. And you know what the real kicker is? There's not much we can do about it. The duopoly of iOS and Android means if both platforms lock down, where do you go? Some Linux phone that can't run any of the apps you need for daily life? It's not realistic for most people. The comments are full of people saying they'll switch to iOS now since at least Apple is honest about being a walled garden, or that they'll try to hold on to their current Android phones as long as possible. But those aren't solutions. They're just surrender. And that's what makes this story so significant. It's not just a policy change. It feels like the end of an era in mobile computing. Now, speaking of freedom and control being taken away from users, this connects directly to our next major story of the week. All right, so here's something that really caught my eye on Hacker News today. Ask HN, the government of my country blocked VPN access. What should I use? This absolutely exploded with over 1,200 points and more than 700 comments. And honestly, it's one of those threads that reminds you how the open internet we take for granted isn't universal anymore. So the original poster is from Indonesia, where apparently the government has started blocking VPN access, and they're asking the community for help. Now, what's fascinating is how quickly this turned into basically a masterclass in anti-censorship technology, with people who've been dealing with this stuff in China and Russia for years, jumping in with battle-tested advice. The conversation gets really technical, really fast. You've got folks recommending these protocols I'd honestly never heard of before. Shadow Socks, Trojan, something called XTLS Reality. These aren't your typical NordVPN or ExpressVPN solutions. They're specifically designed to defeat what's called Deep Packet Inspection, or DPI, which is how governments figure out you're using a VPN in the first place. The basic idea is that these tools disguise your VPN traffic to look like regular HTTPS web traffic. It's like, imagine trying to smuggle something past security by making it look exactly like everything else going through. One of the most interesting threads in the discussion is this debate about whether commercial VPNs are even worth it anymore for serious censorship circumvention. A bunch of users are saying, look, forget the commercial stuff. Just spin up your own VPS on DigitalOcean or AWS, set up SSH tunneling, and you're golden. The logic being that governments are more likely to block known VPN providers' IP addresses, but your random little server in Singapore or Tokyo, that's flying under the radar. But here's where it gets really interesting. There's this one Indonesian user, RD07, who's basically saying, wait, hold up, I'm in Indonesia and I'm not seeing this blocking. I can access X, formerly Twitter, I can get on Discord, everything seems fine. And this kicks off this whole side conversation about whether it's actually government censorship or just certain ISPs being overzealous. It's a good reminder that sometimes these situations are more nuanced than they first appear. The Tor discussion is particularly eye-opening. You know, Tor has this reputation as the ultimate censorship bypassing tool, right? The thing dissidents use, journalists in oppressive regimes. But multiple people in the thread are saying Tor is basically unusable for normal browsing now. Cloudflare blocks most exit nodes. Tons of websites just refuse connections from Tor. One commenter put it pretty bluntly. Tor is effectively dead for regular use. That's kind of shocking if you haven't been keeping up with this stuff. What really strikes me about this whole conversation, though, is the bigger picture stuff. You've got people from Australia and the UK chiming in, worried their countries might be next. There's this real sense that internet freedom is contracting globally, not expanding. And the technical arms race between censors and circumvention tools, it's getting more sophisticated on both sides. The DIY solutions people are sharing are genuinely clever. One person detailed setting up a WireGuard VPN on a cheap VPS. Another talked about using Cloudflare's Warp with specific configurations. There's even discussion about using WebRTC and WebSockets to tunnel traffic in ways that are really hard to detect. It's like The community has developed this whole cookbook of recipes for getting around censorship, passed down from people who've been dealing with the Great Firewall for years. But you know what's kind of sobering? Several commenters point out that all these technical solutions only help the tech-savvy. Your average person who just wants to check Facebook or read international news, they're out of luck. And that digital divide between those who can circumvent censorship and those who can't, that's creating these information bubbles within countries, where different segments of the population are literally experiencing different versions of the internet. The thread also touches on the cat and mouse nature of this whole thing. China's censorship system apparently uses machine learning now to detect VPN traffic patterns. So even these advanced protocols like V2Ray that worked great a few years ago, they're constantly having to evolve. It's exhausting just reading about it. I can't imagine actually having to deal with it daily. There's this underlying current in the discussion about whether fighting censorship technically is even the right approach, or if it's just delaying the inevitable need for political solutions. But in the meantime, people need to communicate, need to work, need to access information, so the technical workarounds continue to evolve. It's simultaneously inspiring and depressing, if that makes sense. And you know, while we're talking about control and censorship, there's another story from Germany that shows this isn't just happening in countries we typically associate with internet restrictions. All right, so our next story is absolutely wild. A German ISP changed their DNS to block my website. And folks, this one really struck a nerve in the community with over 800 points and more than 400 comments. This is one of those David versus Goliath tales that really shows how the internet we thought we knew is, well, it's changing in some pretty concerning ways. So here's what happened. A German developer created this website called QElist.de, and the whole purpose was to shine a light on what websites were being secretly blocked by something called CUII. That's the Copyright Clearinghouse for the Internet. Now, CUII is this private organization in Germany where ISPs and copyright holders basically sit around a table and decide what websites German citizens can and can't access. No judges involved, no public oversight, just corporate interests making decisions about what you can see online. And here's where it gets really interesting. This developer, they figured out a clever way to detect which sites were being blocked. See, when German ISPs blocked a website, they were returning the specific DNS response, a CNAME pointing to notice.cuii.info. It was like they were leaving breadcrumbs everywhere, making it super easy to build a comprehensive list of everything they were censoring. But then, oh man, then the developer discovered something embarrassing. CUII was blocking domains that literally didn't exist anymore. We're talking about websites that had already been seized by authorities, taken completely offline, and CUII was still adding them to their block list. It's like putting up a no trespassing sign on a building that's already been demolished. Just complete incompetence on display. So naturally, when this all got exposed on QElist.de, the ISPs didn't take it well. And this is where it turns from embarrassing to downright authoritarian. Major German ISPs, we're talking Telekom, 1&1, Vodafone, they actually changed their entire DNS infrastructure to hide what they were doing. They removed those telltale CNAME records, made it harder to detect blocked sites, and, get this, they started blocking access to QElist.de itself, the website that exposes censorship potentially getting censored. You can't make this stuff up. The Hacker News discussion on this was fascinating because it really split into two camps. On one side, you had the technical folks pointing out how utterly pointless BNS blocking is. I mean, anyone with even basic technical knowledge can just switch to Google's 8.8.8.8 DNS, or Cloudflare's 1.1.1.1, or use DNS over HTTPS. The whole censorship scheme falls apart with literally a few clicks in your network settings. It's security theater at its finest. But then you had this other group making a much darker point, that this isn't really about effectiveness. It's about normalizing censorship. Sure, tech-savvy users can bypass it easily, but what about your average person? Your grandmother trying to access a website? They're not going to know about alternative DNS servers. And once you've got the infrastructure in place to block piracy sites, well, mission creep is a real thing, folks. There was actually an interesting counterpoint in the discussion from a commenter who noted that CUII has apparently reformed recently and now requires actual court orders instead of making arbitrary decisions. But even if that's true, the fact that they operated for years without judicial oversight and that ISPs went to such lengths to hide their activities when exposed, that tells you everything you need to know about how these systems operate when nobody's watching. What really gets me about this whole situation is the cat and mouse game aspect. You've got one developer with a simple transparency website, and in response, multiple billion-dollar telecommunications companies restructure their DNS systems just to avoid embarrassment. They literally changed their infrastructure because someone dared to document what they were doing. If that doesn't scream, "We know this is wrong," I don't know what does. And look, this isn't just a German problem. Commenters were quick to point out that we're seeing similar trends everywhere. The UK with their porn filters that somehow ended up blocking way more than porn, Australia with their various internet filtering schemes, even discussions about similar measures in the US. It's this gradual erosion of the open internet, always justified by fighting piracy or protecting children or whatever the cause du jour happens to be. The technical community's response was pretty unanimous, though. This kind of censorship is ultimately futile and mainly serves to push development of truly uncensorable protocols. Some folks in the comments were talking about distributed systems, blockchain-based DNS alternatives, all sorts of creative solutions. It's like every time they tighten their grip, more sites slip through their fingers, to borrow a phrase.
But here's the thing that really bothers me about this whole story. It's the secrecy. If CUII and these ISPs truly believed they were doing the right thing, why hide it? Why change your entire DNS infrastructure just because someone published a list of what you're blocking? The fact that transparency itself becomes a target, that should worry everyone, regardless of how you feel about copyright enforcement. Now, let's shift gears from these heavy topics about control and censorship to something that's been a hot debate in the developer community for, well, forever really. But this week, two stories really crystallized this ongoing tension about complexity in software development. All right, now let's dive into something that's got the Hacker News crowd absolutely buzzing. Cognitive load is what matters. And honestly, after reading through this piece and the 362 comments it generated, I can see why it hit such a nerve. This is one of those articles that basically walks into the middle of the tech industry and says, hey, you know all those fancy architectures and trendy frameworks you're so proud of? Yeah, you're doing it wrong. The core argument here is refreshingly simple, which is kind of the whole point. The author argues that cognitive load, basically how much mental effort a developer needs to complete a task, is the fundamental constraint we should be optimizing for. Not performance, not scalability, not whatever the latest architectural pattern promises, just how hard it is for a human brain to understand what's going on. And here's where it gets spicy. The author takes direct aim at what they call really smart developers. You know the type, right? The ones who come in and immediately want to refactor everything using the latest microservices pattern they read about, or insist on adding 3 layers of abstraction because it'll be more maintainable. The article basically says these developers are creating problems, not solving them. They're adding what's called extraneous cognitive load, unnecessary mental burden that has nothing to do with the actual problem being solved. The science behind this is pretty compelling too. Apparently, humans can only hold about 4 chunks of information in working memory at once. 4. And yet, we build these massive systems with dozens of interacting components, each with their own quirks and patterns. The author makes this great point that we spend way more time reading code than writing it. Some estimates say it's like a 10-to-1 ratio. So why are we optimizing for the writing experience? Now, the Hacker News discussion on this got really interesting because it exposed this fundamental tension in our industry. On one side, you've got developers who are like, yes, finally someone said it. Just give me a simple pile of if statements that I can understand. And honestly, there's something to that. One commenter shared how they've seen corporate environments where careful abstractions just get destroyed by constantly changing requirements anyway, so why bother? But then you've got folks like Alphazard who pushed back, arguing that the real reduction in cognitive load comes from code you don't have to read at all. Their point is that clear API boundaries and component guarantees actually reduce cognitive load by letting you ignore implementation details. And they're not wrong either, right? A well-designed abstraction means you can treat something as a black box and not worry about what's inside. What really resonated with me was this discussion about documentation. Several commenters pointed out that good documentation isn't about explaining what the code does. The code already does that. It's about explaining why. Why did we make this architectural choice? Why is this weird edge case handled this specific way? That context is what reduces cognitive load for the next developer who comes along, which might be you in 6 months when you've completely forgotten why you wrote something. There's also this fascinating philosophical divide that emerged in the comments. Some developers argued for what they called boring technology, just using well-understood, simple tools, even if they're not optimal. Others pointed out that sometimes the intrinsic complexity of a problem requires sophisticated solutions. Like, you can't build a distributed database with just if statements, no matter how simple you want to keep things. One commenter, Ivan Jermakov, made an interesting counterpoint. They questioned whether optimizing for the unfamiliar developer jumping into a code-based scenario is even the right goal. Most of the time, you're working with code you or your team wrote. So maybe we should focus on the inherently hard problems rather than worrying so much about onboarding friction. But here's what I think the article really gets right. It challenges this culture we have in tech of complexity worship. You know what I mean? Where using the latest framework or the most sophisticated pattern is seen as a sign of skill or intelligence. The article suggests that maybe, just maybe, the truly skilled developer is the one who can solve complex problems with simple solutions, not the one who solves simple problems with complex solutions.
The discussion also touched on testing, which I thought was a brilliant connection. Good tests reduce cognitive load by giving you confidence. When you know a component is well tested, that's an entire category of worries you can just let go of. You don't need to hold that in your working memory because the tests have your back. What's fascinating is that with 875 points in all those comments, this clearly touched on something fundamental that developers are struggling with daily. We're all feeling this cognitive overload, this sense that our tools and patterns are getting more complex faster than our brains are getting better at handling complexity. And maybe that's the real takeaway here. That as an industry, we need to start treating cognitive load as a first-class constraint, right up there with performance and scalability. Because at the end of the day, software is written by humans for humans, and our brains haven't gotten an upgrade in quite a while. And this debate about simplicity versus complexity, it connects perfectly to our next story. All right, now we're diving into something that really struck a chord with the Hacker News community. Do the simplest thing that could possibly work. This one pulled in over 1,000 points and sparked 365 comments, and honestly, I can see why, because this hits at something every developer wrestles with. So the author makes this pretty bold claim that we should always, and they mean always, choose the simplest possible solution when designing software. Not sometimes, not usually, but all the time. And you know what? They're not just talking about little bug fixes here. They're saying this applies to everything, from fixing a typo to architecting entire systems from scratch. Here's what really got me thinking. They argue that great software design often looks, well, underwhelming. It's so simple, it makes hard problems look easy. And that's exactly why it's great. But here's the kicker. Most engineers, especially when they're starting out, they want to use all the tools in their toolbox, right? You've learned about app servers, proxies, databases, caches, message queues, and it feels so satisfying to wire all these pieces together into this elaborate system. The author uses this brilliant martial arts metaphor that I think really nails it.
You've got the ambitious novice doing all these elaborate moves, exhausting themselves with complexity, and then the old master just steps aside and wins with one precise movement. That's what they're saying good software design should be like. But here's where the discussion gets really interesting. The community had some pretty strong reactions to this. One commenter, Spectral Drift, made this fascinating point about how cloud services have completely flipped what we consider simple. Like, is spinning up a DynamoDB instance simpler than an in-memory solution? Well, if you're thinking about distributed systems and long-term maintenance, maybe it actually is. That's a mind bender, right? And then you've got Borged coming in hot with the opposing view. They're basically saying, look, this simplicity-first approach sounds nice in theory, but in the real world, you're going to regret it. They brought up this example from firmware upgrades where taking the simple path initially led to massive headaches down the road. Their take? Prototype simple, sure, but design robust from the start. What really resonates throughout the whole discussion is this tension about scale. Multiple people pointed out that what's simple for a single server becomes a nightmare when you're dealing with distributed systems. Those big tech problems, enterprise scale stuff, they inherently need complex solutions because you're dealing with so many edge cases and requirements that simplicity becomes almost impossible to define. And here's the paradox that several commenters highlighted. To know what's truly simple, you need years of experience. But by the time you have that experience, you probably don't need someone telling you to keep things simple. Meanwhile, junior developers who actually need this advice might misapply it because they don't yet have the context to understand what simple really means in different situations. You know what I think is fascinating about this whole debate? It's that everyone agrees simplicity is good, but nobody can agree what simple actually means. Is it fewer lines of code, fewer moving parts, easier to understand, easier to maintain, easier to scale? The answer changes depending on your context, your team, your timeline. The discussion also touched on something I see all the time. Engineers designing for imaginary future requirements. What if we need to scale to 1 million users when you've got 12? The author's pushing back against this tendency to imagine some ideal, infinitely scalable, elegantly distributed system instead of deeply understanding what you actually need right now. But I've got to say, the claim that you can follow this principle all the time, that's where even I raise an eyebrow. Some problems are genuinely complex. Some requirements do demand sophisticated solutions. Maybe the real wisdom isn't in always choosing the simplest thing, but in recognizing when complexity is actually necessary versus when it's just engineers being, engineers. What strikes me most about this whole conversation is how it reveals something fundamental about our field. We're constantly balancing between building for today and preparing for tomorrow, between elegant simplicity and necessary complexity. And maybe that tension is exactly where good engineering happens, in that space where you're constantly asking yourself, is this complexity serving a real purpose, or am I just showing off? Speaking of complexity and unintended consequences, let's turn to the AI world, where things are moving so fast that we're basically building the plane while flying it. This week brought us several major AI developments that show both the incredible potential and the serious concerns around where this technology is heading. All right, shifting gears here to something that's got the Hacker News crowd really fired up. We're talking about Claude for Chrome, Anthropic's new browser extension that's basically giving their AI the keys to your browser. And folks, the reaction has been something to behold. So here's what Anthropic is doing. They're piloting this Chrome extension that lets Claude actually see what you're seeing on your screen. Click buttons, fill out forms, the whole 9 yards. Think of it like having an AI assistant that can actually use your computer instead of just talking about using your computer. They're starting small, just 1,000 users on their max plan, which, given what we're about to discuss, might be a very good thing. Now, on paper, this sounds incredible, right? Claude could manage your calendar, schedule meetings, draft email responses right in Gmail, handle expense reports, even test website features for developers. Anthropic's pitch is that so much of our work happens in browsers anyway. This is just the natural evolution. They're calling it inevitable. Their word, not mine. But here's where it gets spicy. The Hacker News community has none of it. I mean, the skepticism is just dripping from these comments. One user called it a lethal trifecta of vulnerabilities. You've got access to private data, exposure to untrusted web content, and the ability to exfiltrate that data, all wrapped up in one neat little package. Someone literally compared it to leaving your credit cards out with the pins written on sticky notes. And get this, even after Anthropic implemented their safety measures, they're still seeing an 11% attack success rate. 11%! That's not a bug, that's a feature at that point. Imagine if your bank's security failed 1 out of every 9 times someone tried to break in.
The technical folks are really tearing into this too. Multiple developers are sharing their experiences trying to get AI to navigate websites, and it's not pretty. One commenter said these models lose context faster than you can say DOM manipulation. They're struggling with basic stuff like radio buttons, getting confused by information-dense pages. Someone described watching their AI agent try to fill out a form as like watching a toddler try to solve a Rubik's Cube. It might get there eventually, but you're going to lose a lot of time and patience in the process. But here's what really caught my attention in the discussion. There's this philosophical debate brewing about whether we're creating this weird Ouroboros situation, the snake eating its own tail. AI is generating content for websites, and now AI is reading and interacting with that AI-generated content. One commenter asked, and I'm paraphrasing here, are we just building elaborate Rube Goldberg machines where robots talk to robots while humans become increasingly irrelevant? Now, to be fair, not everyone's doom and gloom about this. There's this one user, Rosa at HN, who thinks this could actually be the thing that finally disrupts Google's search dominance. Their argument is pretty interesting. Instead of typing URLs or search queries, your AI assistant just suggests the next site you should visit based on what you're trying to accomplish. It's like having a really smart tour guide for the internet. And there's another developer, Shardula Vaker, who claims they've got this working pretty well using a record and replay methodology. They're saying they can handle multi-hour jobs successfully, which, if true, is in stark contrast to everyone else reporting constant failures and frustration. The prompt injection angle is fascinating too. Anthropic's comparing these attacks to phishing, but instead of tricking humans, you're tricking AIs. We're literally having to develop cybersecurity for artificial intelligences now. Think about that for a second. We're creating digital bodyguards for our digital assistants. It's turtles all the way down. What really strikes me about this whole thing is that Anthropic knows they're in a race. They literally say in their announcement that browser-using agents powered by frontier models are already emerging. Translation? Everyone's building this, and we need to be the ones to set the safety standards before someone else ships something truly dangerous. But based on the HN reaction, I don't know if 1,000-user pilot is going to be enough to work out these kinks. When your announcement thread is filled with security researchers essentially screaming, please don't do this, maybe, just maybe, we need to pump the brakes a bit.
The thing is, I get the appeal. I really do. Having an AI that could actually handle the mundane browser tasks would be amazing. But when the people who understand the technology best are this concerned, that's not just healthy skepticism, that's a 5-alarm fire warning. And speaking of Anthropic making controversial moves, that brings us to another story that has their users up in arms. All right, so our next story is about Anthropic updating their consumer terms and privacy policy. And folks, this one has really stirred up the hornet's nest. We're talking 737 points and over 500 comments on Hacker News. And the reaction is overwhelmingly negative. So here's what's happening. Anthropic is rolling out new terms that let users opt in to having their chat data used to improve Claude's capabilities and safety features. Now, I say opt in because that's how Anthropic is framing it. But here's where things get messy. The way they've implemented this has a lot of people crying foul. Multiple commenters are calling it a dark pattern. And honestly, I can see why. The design makes it really unclear what you're actually agreeing to. Some users thought they were just acknowledging the term's update, but surprise, they've actually opted into data sharing by default. That's the kind of UX that makes people lose trust fast. And speaking of trust, this is hitting particularly hard because Anthropic had built up this reputation as the privacy-conscious AI company. You know, the ones who weren't going to be like OpenAI or Google. But now, well, they're doing exactly what OpenAI and Google do with consumer data. The disappointment in the comments is palpable. One user put it pretty bluntly. They're seeing this as Anthropic basically saying, we're not the good guys anymore. Now, here's an interesting wrinkle that not everyone's catching. There's a clear split between how they're treating consumer versus enterprise customers. If you're using Claude for work, the API, Amazon Bedrock, or any of their commercial services, none of this applies to you. Your data stays private, full stop. But if you're on the free tier, Pro, or even Max, their premium consumer tier, you're being asked to contribute your data to the collective improvement of the model.
The intellectual property concerns are particularly fascinating. There are researchers in the comments freaking out about unpublished ideas potentially being absorbed by Claude and then, imagine this scenario, suggested to someone else working on similar problems. One commenter mentioned they've been using Claude to develop novel research ideas, and now they're terrified those concepts could leak out through the model to competitors or other researchers. That's not paranoia. That's a legitimate concern about how these models learn and generate suggestions. But here's where it gets really interesting. Not everyone's against this. There's this minority view in the comments that's actually pro-data sharing. User Yusifov went on this passionate defense, basically saying, look, if we all share our data, we get better AI for everyone. They're frustrated that people are so privacy-obsessed that we're handicapping these systems' ability to learn and improve. Another user, Ludwig, pointed out how annoying it is that Claude can't learn from your corrections. You tell it something once, and next conversation, it's making the same mistake again because it can't train on your interactions. The timeline here is also worth noting. Existing users have until September 28, 2025 to accept these new terms. That's about a month from now. After that, no acceptance means no service. It's a forcing function that's definitely going to cause some user churn. What really gets me about this whole situation is the execution. Even if you believe that training on user data is necessary for AI advancement, and there's a reasonable argument there, the way Anthropic rolled this out feels like a masterclass in how not to handle a privacy policy change. The confusing UI, the opt-out default disguised as opt-in, the sudden pivot from their privacy-first positioning, it's like they took every lesson from the Building Trust with Users playbook and threw it out the window. The comment section is full of people saying they're canceling their subscriptions, and honestly, I think Anthropic might have seriously miscalculated here. When your differentiator in a crowded market has been, we're the ethical AI company, and then you pull something that looks this sketchy, well, you're not just losing customers, you're losing your entire brand identity. The really frustrating part is that there's probably a way they could have done this that would have been acceptable to most users. Be transparent. Make it genuinely opt-in with clear explanations. Maybe offer some perks or discounts for people who choose to share their data. But instead, we got this mess that's now all over Hacker News, with people comparing it to the worst practices of big tech data harvesting.
But not all AI news this week was about privacy concerns and security vulnerabilities. Let's look at something that actually has developers excited. All right. Now we're diving into something that's got the Hacker News crowd absolutely buzzing. Gemini 2.5 Flash Image, or as Google's engineers apparently call it internally, Nano Banana. Yeah, you heard that right, Nano Banana. And with over 1,000 points and nearly 400 comments, this one's clearly struck a nerve in the community. So Google just dropped what they're calling a state-of-the-art image generation and editing model. And folks, the reactions are fascinating. We're talking about a tool that can blend multiple images together, keep characters consistent across different scenes, and edit images just by describing what you want changed in plain English. The pricing? 3.9 cents per image. That's That's genuinely disruptive pricing when you think about what Midjourney and others are charging. What's really catching my attention here is how people are describing this as potentially the GPT-4 moment for image editing. One commenter mentioned there's been a 171 ELO point jump in the rankings, which, if you follow these benchmarks, that's massive. That's not incremental improvement. That's a genuine leap forward. Users are saying the prompt adherence is unlike anything they've seen before. You ask for something specific, and it actually delivers what you ask for, not some vague interpretation. But here's where things get interesting, and honestly, a bit frustrating for many users. Google's implemented these safety restrictions that are driving people up the wall. The model flat out refuses to edit any images containing humans or children. Think about that for a second. You've got this incredibly powerful tool that could restore old family photos, help with professional headshots, remove photo bombers from vacation pics, and it just says, nope, can't touch anything with a person in it. The discussion thread is full of people sharing workarounds and frustrations. One user tried to edit a photo of their kid and got blocked. Another wanted to remove a stranger from the background of their wedding photo, blocked. It's like Google's built this Ferrari of image editing and then limited it to 25 miles per hour because they're worried someone might speed. Now, the technical capabilities that are working, pretty impressive. People are talking about how it handles multi-image composition without any pre-processing. You can literally throw multiple images at it and say blend these together in this specific way, and it just works. The speed is apparently fantastic too. We're talking seconds, not minutes, for complex edits. There's this interesting debate happening about whether it's actually better than Flux or just different. Some users are saying they can't reproduce the examples Google showed in their announcement, getting wildly different results with the same prompts. Others are arguing that Flux, Krea, and Nano Banana each have their strengths. It's not a clear winner situation, more like different tools for different jobs. The pricing structure is clever too. They're charging $30 per million output tokens, with each image eating up about 1,290 tokens. When you do the math, that's how you get to that 3.9 cents per image. For developers and businesses looking to integrate AI image generation, that's game-changing pricing. We're potentially looking at AI image generation becoming a commodity feature rather than a premium service. What I find really intriguing is the Google AI Studio updates they've bundled with this. They're letting developers create custom AI apps with single prompts and deploy straight from the studio or export to GitHub. It's like they're not just releasing a model, they're building an entire ecosystem around it. The code name, though, Nano Banana, I keep coming back to this. It tells you something about Google's internal culture, doesn't it? Here's this serious enterprise product that could reshape creative workflows, and internally they're calling it Nano Banana. There's something refreshingly human about that in an industry that often takes itself too seriously. Look, the bottom line is this. We've got a model that's genuinely impressive in its capabilities, frustratingly limited in its applications due to safety restrictions, and priced to potentially democratize AI image generation. The community's split between excitement about what it can do and frustration about what Google won't let it do. And honestly, both reactions are completely justified. This feels like watching someone build an incredible tool and then wrap it in bubble wrap before handing it over. All right, moving on to our next story, Dissecting the Apple M1 GPU, the end. And wow, this one really caught fire on Hacker News with over 800 points. This is genuinely one of those stories that makes you stop and think about what's possible when raw talent meets determination. So here's the deal. Alyssa Rosenzweig, who started reverse engineering GPUs when she was still in high school, just completed something that most people thought was impossible. She cracked Apple's M1 GPU wide open and built a fully functional open source graphics driver for Linux. And get this, she did it in just 2 years, from December 2020 to December 2022, going from absolutely nothing to running 3D games on Apple Silicon. What really gets me about this story is the timeline. She started reverse engineering Mali GPUs back in 2017 when she was in high school. And by the time she tackled the M1, she was juggling university at Toronto, working part-time at Calabria, and somehow finding time to crack one of the most closely guarded pieces of hardware in the tech industry. The commenters on Hacker News are comparing her to legends like Fabrice Ballard, and honestly, I can see why. There's this great quote from the article that really captures the magic of graphics programming. In 3D graphics, once you can draw a triangle, you can do anything. And that's exactly what happened. Within weeks of starting, she had that first triangle rendering, and from there, it was off to the races. By the end, Asahi Linux had full graphics acceleration, wireless, audio, the whole package running on M1 and M2 Max. Now, what's fascinating about the community reaction is how it's split between pure admiration and some practical concerns. On one hand, you've got people absolutely blown away by the technical achievement, and rightfully so. This is someone who started this project at 18 and wrapped it up at 23, doing what Apple never intended to be possible. But then you've got folks like London's Explorer pointing out that, okay, it's impressive, but there's still no suspend or hibernate support, which, yeah, that's kind of a deal breaker for using this as your daily driver laptop. There's also this interesting legal angle that came up in the comments. Someone asked, why hasn't Apple gone after this project with cease and desist orders like they did with Corellium? And it's a good question, right? This is straight up reverse engineering of proprietary hardware. Maybe Apple realizes the PR nightmare of going after an open source project that's essentially making their hardware more versatile, or maybe they just don't see it as a threat to their ecosystem. The timing of this end announcement is particularly interesting because Alyssa just announced she's joining Intel, and now the Asahi Linux community is wondering, what happens next? Who is going to tackle the M3 and M4 chips? The project lead, Hector Martin, is still around, but losing your GPU expert when Apple keeps churning out new silicon every year, that's gotta sting.
You know what strikes me most about this whole thing? It's the accessibility of complex systems engineering. Here's someone who learned GPU reverse engineering as a teenager from publicly available resources and ended up creating something that benefits the entire Linux community. It really challenges our assumptions about what kind of background you need to tackle these massive technical challenges. You don't need to be groomed at a big tech company for years. Sometimes you just need curiosity, determination, and maybe a little bit of that teenage, I don't know, this is supposed to be impossible energy. The technical achievement here is undeniable, going from zero documentation to a fully functional graphics stack that can run actual games. That's not just impressive, it's historically significant for the open source movement. This is the kind of work that opens up entirely new possibilities for what we can do with our hardware, regardless of what the manufacturer intended. And speaking of deep technical topics that developers care about, let's look at something that might sound niche but could actually change how we think about design. All right, so our next story dives into something that might sound a bit niche at first, but stick with me here. What are OKLCH colors? This one pulled in over 850 points and sparked quite the technical debate with 183 comments. And honestly, once you understand what's going on here, it could change how you think about color in digital design. So here's the deal. You know how when you're designing something, maybe a website or an app, and you're trying to create a color palette that just works together? You pick what should be the same brightness level across different colors, but then that green looks way brighter than the blue, even though the numbers say they're the same. Well, that's because traditional color models like RGB and HSL, they're kind of lying to us. Not intentionally, but they weren't built with human perception in mind. Enter OKLCH. And yeah, I know, another acronym in tech, but this one's actually pretty clever. It stands for, well, the OK part comes from OK Lab color space. And then you've got lightness, chroma, and hue. The breakthrough here is something called perceptual uniformity. Basically, if you change a number by 10%, the color actually looks 10% different to your eyes, no matter where you are in the color spectrum. The article has this brilliant demonstration where they show these pill-shaped buttons, all supposedly the same lightness in traditional sRGB, and wow, they look completely different in brightness. The yellow one practically glows, while the blue one looks super dark. But when you do the same thing in OKLCH, They all look uniformly bright. It's kind of mind-blowing when you see it.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting for developers. With OKLCH, you can literally just keep your lightness and chroma values constant, spin that hue wheel from 0 to 360 degrees, and boom, you got a perfectly coordinated color palette. No more endless tweaking, no more, does this purple go with this orange? Just math that actually matches what your eyes see. But, and there's always a but, right? The Hacker News discussion got pretty heated about some real-world limitations. One of the big issues that came up is gradients. See, OKLCH uses this polar coordinate system. Think of it like colors arranged in a circle. When you try to blend between colors that are far apart on that circle, sometimes the gradient takes a scenic route through colors you definitely didn't want. One commenter, tired of life, put it perfectly. With RGB, you order green salad, you get green salad. With OKLCH, you order green salad, you get beet soup. The technical folks in the comments really went deep on this. Turns out, when you're interpolating between distant hues in OKLCH, the gradient might swing through out-of-gamut colors, colors that literally can't be displayed on your screen. And then the correction algorithms kick in, and you get these weird, muddy transitions. Several people pointed out that OKLCH, which is the rectangular coordinate version of the same color space, actually handles gradients better. In fact, Tailwind CSS apparently switched from OKLCH to OKLCH as their default for exactly this reason. There's also this fascinating debate about whether we're over-engineering this whole thing. User Chris Morgan made a pretty compelling argument that perceptual color spaces are being massively over-applied, and that they're actually terrible at handling the edges of what screens can display. They're saying, look, from most use cases, the traditional models work just fine, and all this perceptual uniformity stuff creates more problems than it solves when you're dealing with real-world constraints. But then you've got other folks saying, no, this is exactly what we need for systematic design. Instead of designers having to manually adjust every single color to look right, you can use mathematical relationships to guarantee visual consistency. Imagine being able to generate an entire dark mode theme by just adjusting the lightness parameter. The unintuitive nature of the values came up a lot too. With HSL, people have internalized that 0 degrees is red, 120 is green, 240 is blue. But OKLCH, completely different mapping. You've got to relearn where all your colors live, and the chroma boundaries, they're not exactly intuitive either.
What really strikes me about this whole discussion is how it shows the gap between theoretical elegance and practical implementation. OKLCH is mathematically beautiful, perceptually accurate, and conceptually clean. But when the rubber meets the road, or I guess when the pixels meet the screen, you run into all these edge cases and gotchas that make adoption tricky. It's a classic case of perfect being the enemy of good, or maybe good enough being the enemy of better. Still, I think we're going to see more tools and frameworks adopting this or similar perceptual models, even with the limitations. The benefits for creating consistent, accessible color systems are just too compelling to ignore. We just might need a few more iterations to work out the kinks. And that wraps up our deep dive into this week's top stories from Hacker News. What a week it's been! From Android's shift toward a more closed ecosystem to breakthrough AI models, from the ongoing battle for internet freedom to fundamental debates about how we should be writing code. What really strikes me about this week's collection of stories is how they all seem to be circling around this central tension, the push and pull between control and freedom, between simplicity and complexity, between what technology companies want and what users need. Whether it's Google locking down Android, ISPs secretly censoring websites, or AI companies walking back their privacy promises, we're seeing this broader trend of technology becoming less open, less transparent, and honestly, less trustworthy. But we're also seeing incredible innovation, from individual developers like Alyssa Rosenzweig cracking open Apple's GPU, to new color models that could revolutionize design, from AI that can edit images with natural language, to communities sharing censorship-bypassing techniques. It's this constant reminder that no matter how much control big tech tries to exert, there's always someone out there finding a way around it,
building something better, or just refusing to accept the status quo. These were the stories that dominated the conversation this week, the ones that got thousands of developers arguing, sharing, and thinking about where our industry is headed. And if this week is any indication, we're in for quite a ride. Thanks for joining me for this week's Roundup. Keep questioning, keep building, and we'll see you next week with another collection of the stories that matter most to the Hacker News community. Until then, stay curious.